session of this last day of our symposium. We ended our last session with talking about the place of spirituality in posthumanism. Spirituality plays a part in posthumanism because posthumanism refuses reductive definitions of the human. It embraces our embodied and relational existences, but refuses a material, mental, or biological reduction of what it means to be human. As a result, it is open to engagement with the archives of spiritual practices and experiences that extend, transform, or reconfigure our ontologies, instrumentalities, and physicalities. India provides a particularly rich history of such practices and experiences that fall under the general rubric of yoga and tantra. Modernist academic disciplines have tended to shy away from these considerations, partly due to their investment in an exclusive rationality, and in more contemporary times due to their distrust of an orientalizing romanticism. But some of its disciplines, such as transpersonal psychology, or in our case, posthumanism, have actively sought engagement with these archives, though with a critical eye towards orthodox appropriations, unverifiable truth claims, anti-materialism, and world negation. So our session this morning engages with this aspect of posthumanism. One of the new academic disciplines that has emerged to address this field in the academy is yoga studies. And one of the founders of this discipline in the academy, an eminent scholar practitioner of yoga, is our keynote speaker today, Professor Christopher Chapple. Christopher K. Chapple, PhD, is Doshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology and founding director of the Master of Arts in Yoga Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. A specialist in the religions of India, he has published more than 20 books, including the recent Living Landscapes, Meditations on the Elements in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain yogas. He serves as advisor to multiple organizations, including the Forum on Religion and Ecology, the Ahimsa Center, the Dharma Academy of North America, the Jain Studies Center at SOAS London, the South Asian Studies Association, and International School for Jain Studies in New Delhi. He teaches online through the Center for Religion and Spirituality at Loyola Marymount University and Yoga Glow in Los Angeles. Welcome, Chris. Dr. Chapple's topic today is yoga in a post-humanist era. On to you.
Thank you, Debashish, for that generous introduction. And I want to say a special hello to Amrita, who I see is with us for this occasion. And I'm glad to
Hi,
connect.
Chris.
Good to hear your voice. It's been a long time since we've seen each other. So in the précis that I presented, I call out 4 themes. I begin with the animality of yoga, invoking what most people consider in the modern world to be yoga, this connection through asana and with body, with the potential for movement and for the potential to feel a sense of continuity between the animal realm in all of its grandeur and the human realm. Another aspect that I call out is gender. And in yoga, we have Prakriti, the manifest taking so many numerous forms. And we have interesting narratives that subvert strict gender categories and allow the male to acknowledge the materiality as inseparable, and for the female, of course, to always acknowledge, as did Chaudhuri in the Yoga Vasishta, the preeminence of the witness consciousness. Then I've suggested that we can think about yoga in terms of who has owned yoga in recent times. And first, the revolutionaries, and I will name these. Second, the nationalists who want to say that, oh, this is the best thing offered to the world, and it's exclusively to be identified with all things India. And then we have renouncers who say politics has nothing to do with the sacred traditions of yoga. And then we have neoliberal capitalists who are, as we will see, doing their best to make a dime and a dollar and many rupees from the yoga experience. So all of that cast of characters, starting with animals and acknowledgement of our gender, continuing with the claiming of yoga by these various communities, will sort of shape and guide the presentation as I will present it. And if I could ask the host to enable screen share, I've prepared some slides that I would like to be able to show, if that is available and accessible to me. So if I made a co-host, then I will be able to screen share.
Yes, please enable screen share, Parithro.
Sir, I think while recording it can't be done. Yes, it's done. It's done.
Here we go.
It is done. Yeah. Now you can screen share.
Okay.
I think it's fine.
All right, so yoga in a post-humanist world. And I wanted to share an early image from the Indus Valley civilization and just give a little bit of a litany, if I may, of the early record of the textual aspects of yoga and demonstrate along the way that this is Brahmanical, Buddhist, and Jaina. Maitreya Sveteshvatara Upanishad, Satipatthana, Acharanga Sutra, Bhagavad Gita, Sankhya Karika, Yoga Sutra, Yoga Bindu, Yoga Vasishta, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Garanda Samhita, just a few of the hundreds and hundreds of texts. And at ground, we have a definition of yoga as Yogashchittavritti Nirodha from Yoga Sutra 1.2. And this may be translated as yoga holds thought, chitta, and action, vritti, in abeyance, Nirodha. Why do we do yoga? Hayam dukam anagatam. The purpose of yoga is to avoid future pain. And as we think of post-human, I think we need to think of the pre-human, the human, and the post-human. And if we think of this in terms of temporality, we have a history, we have a present moment, and we look forward to a future. And here I wanted to do a little bit of a land acknowledgement, of a place acknowledgement. I am in Los Angeles. And what I wanted to start with is a short summary of the three waves, perhaps leading to a fourth wave of yoga, particularly as found in America. And the first, the transcendentalists and the first yogis. The second, the return of the yogis to America. The third, starting in the 1990s, Americans going to study yoga in India and then coming back to open studios. So first, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Louisa May Alcott, Walt Whitman, these early transcendentalists, each in her or his own way, lifted up knowledge as it was being received through translations done in the latter half of the 19th century. And then finally, in 1893, the very famous Parliament of the World's Religions brought India to the shores of the United States. And Swami Vivekananda, from, of course, West Bengal, lived here in Pasadena for 6 weeks in 1900 and wrote the book Raja Yoga in this very house, which is now owned by the Vedanta Society. And Paramahansa Yogananda, also a Bengali, lived in the USA from 1920 until his death in 1952. And you can see in this photograph, he opened the Church of All Religions in Hollywood. And if you've not seen this film, Awake, it presents the story with original footage of Yogananda. So this constitutes the first part of the first wave, but I wanted to talk about a very significant bridge figure. And this is a photograph. Some may recognize Jeff Long, an India scholar, on the left. And then on the right is Reverend James Lawson. And James Lawson had traveled to India in the 1950s to take up work as a school teacher. He lived near Sevagram and learned the techniques from the folks at the ashram there of nonviolent resistance. And he, 92 years old, continues to teach these techniques. And his students included Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, John Lewis, and hundreds of others who changed the world. And because of the changes brought about, the world reopened to India in a new way. In 1924, there was legislation put in place that forbade any person from India to move to the United States. And due to the good work of James Lawson and Martin Luther King Jr., legislation was passed in 1965 that struck down the Asian Exclusion Act. And a number of yogis began to come to America to teach, including Swami Satchidananda. And an early adapter, Lilias Follin, started teaching yoga on TV, which became a very, very important medium for the distribution of yoga knowledge. Swami Vishnu Devananda came many times, as well as in this early wave of people, my own teacher, Grani Anjali, herself also from Kolkata. And what we were able to enjoy in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s was a transmission from these wonderful people from India who, as had Paramahansa Yogananda before them, brought about yoga in a new idiom. Then there were yogis that primarily stayed in India, and a number of Americans went to India to study with these individuals. These include Krishnamacharya from Mysore, BKS Iyengar, his student in Pune, Pattabhi Joyce in Mysore, and his grandson Sharat here. Krishnamacharya's own son, Deshikachar, who was teaching in Chennai. Indra Devi, a very important woman who had come from Europe, insisted that Krishnamacharya teach her yoga. He at first resisted, and then he gave instruction, and she became the yoga teacher in Hollywood, sought after in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. And as you can see, she lived a very full and very productive life. And one of the Americans that I want to introduce here, Larry Payne, who has given us these two books, Yoga for Dummies and Yoga RX, studied with Krishnamacharya, studied with Pattabhi Joyce, and began to really think about how to modernize yoga for wide consumption. And in the 1990s, students, primarily of Mr. Iyengar and Mr. Joyce, or I should say Professor Joyce, started an organization called Yoga Works that became very well known with franchises all through the country, began to amalgamate private yoga studios into a central system, and created a new phenomenon called the yoga business. And the success of this yoga business has resulted in tens of millions of yoga practitioners participating in studio yoga classes on a regular basis. And it's estimated that in 2016, this is as recent as 5 years ago, that 80 million people would have tried yoga here in the United States, which is about 25% of the population. And they believe it's good for you, that it increases flexibility and strength and athletic performance, that it relieves stress. And many people do it in clubs or health clubs or gyms. And it, even 5 years ago, was estimated to be a $16.8 billion enterprise. And some of it is quite grand. As you can see, there are wonderful models who have become, and dancers and gymnasts who have taken up yoga and made this part of literally their livelihood. And with this recent commodification of yoga has come critique. And as this book by Andrea Jain points out, yoga has gone from counterculture to pop culture. And the question becomes, has the romanticism been lost? Has the integrity been lost? Has the philosophy been eclipsed? Has yoga become nothing more than vanity? Well, I wanted to, return to some of those questions as we move forward, but I wanted to point out that the Yoga Alliance, which came up about 20 years ago, developed 200, 300, 500-hour trainings that now proliferate even in India. There's the International Association of Yoga Therapists, which came up around 10 or 15 years ago, has developed a 1,000-hour training. And that, as Debashish mentioned earlier, there are now several Master of Arts in Yoga Studies worldwide. Ourselves here in Los Angeles, SOAS at London, Foscari University in Venice, Italy, Naropa in Boulder, Naropa University, the Shingal Center at Graduate Theological Union and Berkeley. And as of just about 3 or 4 years ago, there are now 54 academic programs for BA, MA, and even PhD studies under development in India. And I published an article based on research I did in these programs while on a Fulbright in 2019. And if anyone is interested, I can share that with you. So on the one hand, we have this very consumerist-based, neoliberal, pay money to do yoga. And on the other hand, we have professional societies and associations, as well as universities and colleges that are really taking yoga seriously. Here is an image from the Mahatma Gandhi Hospital in Pondicherry, where Dr. Bhavanani runs a very comprehensive yoga therapy program, and every person admitted to this very, very large hospital complex is given access to one aspect or another of yoga therapy. And then I wanted to share an image from our own classroom at Loyola Marymount University, where the physical dimensions of yoga, as well as the philosophical, are again quite at center. Now, Datta Vaswani at the Parliament of the World's Religions in 1999 in Cape Town called forth 3 freedoms. And when we think of the word freedom, we can think of moksha. When we think of enlightenment, we can think of sattva. But as we look at the melding of cultures, and we will hear a great deal about Sri Aurobindo tonight, who is part of this march forward of history, we can look at freedom being newly interpreted. In the 18th century, we see the liberation of white men from serfdom. America, 1776, the French Revolution, and then eventually Leo Tolstoy, some decades later. The second freedom is the end of slavery. Abolished in Britain in 1833, abolished through America's 13th Amendment in 1865. And in the 20th century, we find the liberation of women. Susan B. Anthony advocating successfully for the women's right to vote, although it did not happen until after her death. And Jane Addams, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, a woman who did so much fine work for the uplift of impoverished peoples. And in the 20th century, and here's where I want to call out some of these revolutionaries, the work of freedom continues, but it's specifically informed by yoga. And Mahatma Gandhi, thankfully, helped put an end to the British colonialism that had wreaked havoc with the Indian economy. And Howard Thurman went in 1935, a prominent African-American theologian, to study with Gandhi. And in turn, James Lawson studied in India Gandhian techniques and brought forth an incisive critique of what he calls the plantation capitalism that undergirds the economic systems of global business. Martin Luther King Jr. took up the call of Gandhian nonviolence and spoke of the beloved community and reaching that freedom using the metaphor of the mountaintop. Which brings us to now the 21st century, where, as Dada Vaswani said, we must work as people of yoga for the liberation of the earth. We must develop the discernment skills to resist the colonization of the human mind by advertisers, by Facebook. We must resist the loss of truth. And what post-humanism calls us to do is to remember, reclaim, and return to the core principles of yoga, which are ahimsa and holding the truth. Now I'm going to share a song, and I'll return to the lyrics.
The earth is burning, the sky is ablaze. The earth is burning, the sky is ablaze. Thoughts of the past haunt us every day. Thoughts of the past haunt us every day. We turn to the day, we go into the night. We turn to the day, we go into the night. The earth is burning, the sky is ablaze. The earth is burning, the sky is ablaze. Pollution on the land, in the waters, in the air. Pollution on the land, in the waters, in the air. Where are the fires? We keep looking for that place with that embrace. We keep looking for that place with that embrace. The earth is burning, the sky is ablaze. The earth is burning, the sky is ablaze. Stranded in this world, you and me all alone. Stranded in this world, you and me all alone. You are my hope, I am your hope. You are my hope, I am your hope. The earth is burning, the sky is ablaze. The earth is burning, the sky is ablaze.
Granianjali Inti, whose image you saw earlier, wrote the words and the music. It was performed by Karan Dukas. And I thought this was an apt way to draw our attention to the current urgency of post-humanism. And this lyric and melody captures the difficulties of alienation and lifts up.
Please close your mic.
Please close your mic. Please close your mic.
Lifts up the truth of our environmental predicament and says, where do we find possibility? I am your hope. You are my hope.
Aritra, can you mute everyone? Creating disturbance. Aritra, can
Yes,
you mute everyone?
yes.
Except Chapple. With the Chapple.
Okay, so I'd like to, I know that we only have about 10 minutes left, and I know everyone's been told to turn off your microphone, but if anyone would like to unmute and ask a question, that would be fine. And I'm more than happy to entertain any questions that might have come up in this rather quick overview of yoga.
Yes, Chris. So just to wrap up or summarize a little bit and then open it to discussion. So as you pointed out, yoga has seen a number of waves of development, both in India as well as in the West. You emphasized the entire chapter in the West, but also went in tandem with what was happening in India. Of course, due to the extremely short sort of scope of time, you had to create a really, simplified version. But we do know, I mean, apart from the people who went back and forth, there were texts that went back and forth. And, even in terms of the revolutionary period, the very early Swadeshi period, where people like Sri Aurobindo were involved, and an entire slew of people, the whole chapter of yoga really becomes very prominent. That's where it really enters. And then also you talked about how that entered into counterculture in the West, and then finally the entire consumerist turn, and now the sort of critical turn, one may say. And it's a really interesting story. So how does, this today, when we are talking about all these strands that coexist, one may say, or what would you see as a way going forward that actually empowers us? And you talked about the liberation of the earth and your own work with ecology, for example, and the yoga traditions, gifts to ecology. Would you like to say a few words about that? And then open it to others that might like to ask you a few more questions.
Yeah, what I would like to respond, and thank you, that was an excellent summary of where we just traveled, but I would like to look forward to yoga as providing an antidote to cynicism, as providing an antidote to that sense of helplessness that confronts particularly young people today. And many people see nothing but trouble ahead with the environment. Many people have lost faith in government for good reasons all over the planet. And what the practice of yoga can do is help the individual develop a sense of intimacy, both with self and with other. And that other can be the animal realm, it can be the human realm, it can be the elemental realm. Whatever portal works can help the individual to recover a sense of meaning and to feel an embrace of community. And here, I think, the data, shows that these are the very reasons why people are taking up yoga. And in the doing of it, they are able to find some purpose and some meaning moving forward.
Thank you, Chris. If there are questions, I think it would be good to put your questions down in the chat box so that they can be addressed serially. Anybody wants to put a question in the chat box? Well, while people are thinking about that, let me field another question. And that has to do with something else you mentioned, which is the national appropriation of yoga. On the one hand, yoga becomes a huge industry. And on the other hand, you have a kind of, national trademarking, identity marking that is also going on. As you said, it becomes associated with India. And what would you say about that in terms of how, how it impacts, in a way, the liberational potency or potential of yoga?
Yeah, I've done work with various organizations, including the Hindu America Foundation. And we had a rather interesting and a little bit testy conversation where this group of really wonderful, well-intentioned people wanted to say that yoga is Hindu and that to suggest that other people can do yoga is not a good thing. And their position was sort of non-historical because yoga was born with not only the work of the Upanishads, but of the work of the Buddha, the work of Mahavira, has found expression in many, many different traditions philosophically. And it has been embraced in the Muslim world for 1,000 years and is actively practiced. And in fact, in the census, in I think it was 1890, 25% of yogis interviewed and surveyed by the British, and they were very meticulous in their record keeping, but a full 25% of the yogis said they were Muslim. So to, again, essentialize an identity and then as one particular faith and say that Hinduism can claim or does claim ownership of yoga is doing a disservice to the realities historically, as well as realities in the present day. And this is true, of course, in America and Europe, where many, many, many millions of people would still identify their faith tradition as Christian or Jewish, and yet will simultaneously take up the practice of yoga and do this in a sincere way. So this rejection of essentialism, I think, is important to keep in mind.
Thank you, Chris. But at the same time, would you say that you know, all the traditions, I completely agree with you, all the traditions that you talked about, they may have become traditions, but yoga is like a kind of a underlying thread of shared practices, an entire body of ideas and practices, conversational counters that have been adapted to different ends by many different people. But I also would like to ask you that still it's a long historical conversation among these partners. And when it translates to another continent or the rest of the world, like Europe and America, there is always the danger of skimming the surface and you didn't begin as a conversation partner. You just took what you wanted to and gave it your own name. So you just borrowed the name and did what you want with it, distorted it. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, I've watched this happen, sort of the fitness yoga craze. And I want to respond to that question in tandem with Jeffrey Bussolini's question that has been posted in the chat. And there's a physicality, a biological base to yoga experience, an animality to yoga experience that both subverts and transcends the facile approach. So what happens, even in sitting in a meditative pose or even standing in the tree pose, is that there's a shift of awareness that brings about a bridge into the subworld and into the uber world. And this transformational moment, which could last only sort of maybe a split second, it could stretch out quite a bit longer. The technical term in yoga language would be a samadhi experience, is one that we recognize from ethological experience. One of the things that I've enjoyed about the pandemic is that people have discovered birds in a way that has lightened the conversation, I think, really throughout the globe. And people are noticing. And noticing and observing is really all about the elevation of consciousness And this is something far more radical than the mercantilism that we come to be thinking about when we think about the modern studio type of yoga. So I know this is a little bit of a ramble, but what I would like to suggest is that in building this skill of observation through noticing body, noticing breath, and as I've taken up in this most recent book that Debashish mentioned, the core practice, if I were to articulate, in addition to the yamas and niyamas, which were at the very center and heart of the yoga training that I received back in the 1970s and 80s, from the 6th month forward, we were immersed in sustained, twice daily, month-long reflection on earth, on water, on fire, on air, on space, and on animals. And this decenters the Anthropocene in a certain sense, because once you start to be observant and start to become absorbed in these other realms, then you can never go back to that rather trivial way. And one of the things that I've had the good fortune to do is to train hundreds of, either directly or indirectly, teachers of yoga, and some of them are beginning to lift up and to introduce their own students to some of these practices, which at heart are really shamanic and are designed to bring about the depth connection with the more than human realm that is so essential for our well-being.
Thank you, Chris. I think it clearly shows, your talk clearly shows what a rich resource yoga can provide to post-humanism, and particularly from the Indian context. The engagement with these traditions gives us practices that have existed for a long time to prepare subjectivity to become post-human. I think Shamrat has a question.
Thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed your talk. I just wanted to know that, in the Western epistemological framework, we delineate the mind-body relationship in a particular way, giving primacy to the mind. And in the modern Western civilization, we hardly have in the kind of beyond the structural framework of human. The human. But here in yoga, there are possibilities of body difference.
It's an excellent question. Mind-body split has begun to collapse in the West. And the big as well as forth an awareness that we have to see the continuity between body, mind, and our desire to live. And this yeah, it's a good moment for yoga because it's become so essential. And yeah, it's a good question, and healing is possible. And the abstraction of the mind has more or less revealed itself to be a fallacy. And it's interesting because philosophically, people have been grasping at Merleau-Ponty, and they've been trying to find phenomenology of the body in a philosophical way. And then Debashish's work has called out people like Judith Butler and others who have sort of brought the body back. And the resources within the yoga, particularly the subtle physiology of yoga, which is now pretty much known to every American, has really helped to advance this, as I call it, the healing process.
Thank you, Chris. It is very interesting that, you know, I mean, it's ironic and paradoxical also that this big consumer market of yoga practice in America and in the West, at the same time, has changed perceptions of what it means to be human in terms of this mind-body split. Because if you even skim the surface, if you just go a little deeper in any conversation, you'll find that the person you're talking to knows about the chakra system, you know, does meditation, has some experiences that are directly related to the body. Things of that kind are entering at a popular level, sometimes in a questionable frame. But nevertheless, it's an interesting moment, I'd say, of time. So I think we'll stop here. Chris, thank you very much for your talk. And we'll take a short break. We're running a little late. We're running 10 minutes late. So we'll take a short break of about 3 to 4 minutes. Come back at 10:30. Or it's about 10:40. We'll come back at 10:43, and Chris will chair the next panel on yoga and tantra.
Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody back. And we're going to hear from 4 scholars, and 2 will be speaking on Sri Aurobindo, and 1 will be speaking on climate change and yoga, a topic very, very important. And then another will speak about the crematorial calling. So we're going to open with Shubham Datta. And what I would like each of the speakers to do is to try to keep it within 12 minutes of presentation. And then we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions. But we really do need to try to get a little bit back on schedule. And as you begin, please give a brief introduction of who you are and where you are, affiliation, and current interest. So Shubham, if you are available, I invite you to come forward.
Yes, good morning. This is Shubham Datta. Yes, let me switch on the video. Am I visible? Okay, I think there is a background light coming in. So, yes, thank you very much. A very good morning to one and all. And my presentation will be on Sri Aurobindo's Karakahini, a prison memoir. And I will try to show how Sri Aurobindo in this prison memoir contest the anthropocentric bias around which the colonial governmentality was built. So I have a small PPT to share. So I would like to request the administrator to enable the screen sharing. So I don't know how to share this. Yes, share this.
At the bottom of your window, there's a little green things. Okay, good.
Okay, okay. Yes. So can you see my screen, sir?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. Okay. So the title of my paper is The Abject Body and the Eternal Consciousness, the Human and the Non-Human Interface in Sri Aurobindo's Karakahini. So Karakahini, of the Tales from Prison Life, is a prison memoir by Sri Aurobindo. I think this panel needs to be sidelined somehow. And in Karakahini, Sri Aurobindo locates a stringent critique of the colonial form of justice and system. Also, the text quite persistently seeks to engage with a new vision of ethical justice, retaining the autonomy of being. The autonomy of being seems to be intrinsic to Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, Sri Aurobindo's tenor of consciousness. The text is a retrospective account of his suffering in a claustrophobic prison space. However, paradoxically, he calls this suffering in the prison as a pilgrimage. So I will try to show how Sri Aurobindo's narrative seeks to subvert the prison space, seeks to rewrite and subvert the prison space. So before I go into Karakahini, let me share the brief timeline of Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo was born in 1872 in Kolkata, went to England at the age of 7 in 1879. I'm not reading out. Published his first songs to Matila in 1897. In 1905, Bhavani Mandir. In 1906, the launch of periodical Bande Mataram. In 1906, he joined active politics. And in 1908, he got detained for the Alipur bomb case, and publication of Karakahini follows in 1909. So my research questions that I am going to dwell on in this paper are, firstly, how Karakahini systematically departs from the anthropocentric bias that has been intrinsic to Aurobindo's philosophy and politics? Secondly, how can we rethink the relationship between human and non-human vis-a-vis Sri Aurobindo's conceptual paradigms? Early poetics of Sri Aurobindo tellingly demonstrates an acute sense of loss and affective urge for return to the motherland. Since he was displaced quite early from India, this affective pull was predominantly mediated by imagination rather than memory. What is striking about Sri Aurobindo's vision of India is his early poetics is the constant reference to the divinization of the divinity of the land. Sri Aurobindo's poetics evocatively invokes natural imagery and imbues spiritual qualities within them and launches a quest for a divine or a messianic presence to salvage the motherland. The political teleology of Sri Aurobindo. There is obviously a search for a natural and cultural imaginary in Sri Aurobindo, and there is also an attempt, a conscious departure from the model of governmentality, and also the thrust on the activation of psychic consciousness within the individual. And also there is a politicization of the affective through the evocation of the imagery of Bharat Mata. And in Bhavani Mandir, there is an epistemolization of the concept of the nation as Shakti. Shakti that acts as a repository of human consciousness in Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo interiorizes the question of nation as part of human consciousness, placing them within the rhetoric of simultaneity with human mind. Sri Aurobindo's politics. There are several points around which Sri Aurobindo's politics is built. At one level, structured itself around the notion of an affective unity among the sparse and heterogeneous group of Indian citizens. At another, it grounds itself in a futuristic direction leading to the emancipation of humanity from the native and the colonialist dogmas and practices. Structurally, Sri Aurobindo's imbrication of politics and spirituality emanated from a goal of bringing the common populace under a common nationalistic rubric to lend it a proper shape and guiding principle. As historians Andrew Satori, Barbara Sadat points out that spiritual imagery was discursively embedded in Sri Aurobindo's cultural and political register. It acted as a departure from the ethnocentric bias of European nationalism. Also, it enunciated a type of resistance through the evocation of an alternative cultural and political idiom remaining within the fold of the colonial governmentality. So Sri Aurobindo, beyond the question of political ontology, in Sri Aurobindo's poetics, there is an evocative invocation of natural imagery and also the spiritual qualities within them. In his politics, one finds the articulation of selfhood, where the ideological merge into a search for a cosmic union. Consciousness is certainly an entry point to his politics, but in ultimate turn, it belongs to a realm of an excess which refuses any form of political ontologization. Prathama Banerji, in her recent book, Elementary Aspects of the Political, argues Sri Aurobindo's use of Shakti as, let me quote, force here is a non-human or extra-human phenomena, which is impossible to harness as an instrument of human action. It is precisely this resistance to instrumentalization that makes force politically efficacious. Continued, Sri Aurobindo beyond the political ontology, Banerji's argument goes against the reading of a strong anthropocentric bias in Sri Aurobindo. Instead, it questions the human and the non-human duality and argues how they co-constitute each other. Banerji further argues that how Sri Aurobindo's recognition of a friendship with divine opens up a new space of sociality that dangerously disrupt the norms of sociality, the convention and society. So Banerji's points is very key to my argument, because Banerji shows how there are post-humanist possibilities present, embedded in Sri Aurobindo nationalist discourse. And she recurrently refers to the idea of Shakti and the question of divine friendship. And she refers how Sri Aurobindo builds the question of nationalism around the idea of Shakti to invoke a non-human and an extra-human force, Deconstructing the relationship between material household of graded inequalities and desire, Sri Aurobindo forges a link between the material and the divine, in which the inequalities are displaced or erased beyond the human control. Okay, so let me come to the philosophy of consciousness. In Sri Aurobindo's philosophy of consciousness, the question of rigidity of human and the non-human binary is challenged. The interplay between human and the non-human shapes the aesthetics of transcendence in Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo's teleology of transcendence remains premised on the concept of evolution and involution. Quite like Hegel, in Sri Aurobindo's schema too, one finds a strong presence of a universal consciousness. But Sri Aurobindo's universal consciousness is not measured by the cartography of reason. Instead, he posits consciousness as a supramental awareness, identifying being and consciousness with supreme bliss, quote unquote, Ananda. Sri Aurobindo and cosmic Leela. The recognition of the strong extra-human, extraterrestrial force situates the authority of Sri Aurobindo's thought. It is interesting and ironical at the same time that Sri Aurobindo's conceptualization of the divine other also takes an anthropomorphic dimension, quite like Rabindranath's Jivan Devata. If we quote it from here, if we look at world existence rather in its relation to its self-delight or eternally existing being, we may regard, describe, and realize it as Lila, the play, the child's joy, perpetually inexhaustible, creating, recreating himself for the sheer bliss of self-creation, of the self-representation, himself the play, himself the player, himself the playground. So the extra-human force is referred as he, himself the play, himself the player, himself the playground. So it's clearly anthropomorphic. Involution, evolution. The process of involution and evolution takes place through a process of human action. It is in Sri Aurobindo's schema, involution and evolution plays a pivotal role in shaping the human transformation. It's augmented by the interplay between dharma, an inner spiritual consciousness, and karma, the ethicality of human action. Sri Aurobindo's evolutionary doctrine is based on the psychization of human being, which leads to a kind of trans-individuation through the ethicality of action and the realization of spiritual consciousness. The cosmic field born out of this involution-evolution model is a field of radical plurality and seeks to realize a specific kind of non-dualism which conserves a life of experience evolving multiplicity in a pantheism of simultaneous transcendence and immanence. This is a quote from Professor Banerji's recent book. Now let me come to my actual text. The text that I'm dealing with in this paper is Karakahini. And in Karakahini, how Sri Aurobindo offers a carceral topography. Sri Aurobindo's narrative is in Karakahini, unlike an ordinary prison memoir, foregrounds a stable narratorial self and the teleology of transformation and resistance. So it's a tale of transformation and resistance. As I pointed out before, in Karakahini, you find the journey of a picaro into a pilgrim. So it's an evolutionary book. It's not like a record of the prison experiences. Rather, in every page of this book, you find that there is a resistance to the colonial form of prison, and there is an attempt at rewriting the colonial prison in this book. The narration does not verge on the effective experientiality or the treacherous fluidity of memory. Instead, it establishes the presence of a coherent narratorial self and portrays a journey of evolution from a prisoner to pilgrim. So I am not quoting the lines from the book. If you want to look at the book, I can share the book with you, or I can share the PPT with the authority. So I don't have any problem. I have shared the paper as well. And there I have quoted some portions from the book, you can check. So I am not reading it. And again, continued carceral topography, how Sri Aurobindo describes how hellish, how brutish, how confining the whole experience of prison was, and how he was restricted to a 6 feet decree, quote unquote, and how dehumanizing the entire torture of the prison was. So this is what Sri Aurobindo is showing in his account of Karakahini. But again, I should reiterate that this account of Karakahini is interspersed with a narrative resistance to conform to the British torture and to retain the autonomy of being, the autonomy of selfhood. The prison of Sri Aurobindo is recurrently equated with a cage in the narrative, which brings to the fore how the human body was, quote unquote, animalized or dehumanized in the prison. Sri Aurobindo's topography of the prison experience comes with the realization of the repressive state apparatus of the imperial machinery, and also with the recognition of the materiality of pain that was absent in his political spiritual discourse hitherto before. So in the political spiritual discourse before, it was the focus was entirely on human action, human consciousness, and that is why there was an absence of this pain that he suffers from, that he experiences in the prison. And in this prison life, I think this experience of pain, experience of the radical other, leads to a self-realization of Sri Aurobindo that I have explored in the next slides. Interestingly, before this phase, Sri Aurobindo's thrust remained predominantly on the ethicality of human action and the transformation of consciousness. Prison experience led him to realize or recognize the being as the other in the face of a radically unfamiliar other, which continually tests the boundaries of the self and the other. So the question of the autonomy of self and the other is constantly, is continually disrupted in the confinement of the prison, in the darkness of this prison, which hardly has any exposure to the outside world. So as I have depicted here, the abject prison. So this picture I have taken from Sri Aurobindo's book, The Objectified Prison, and you can find it out, the ambiguous whole of the prison. So while firmly cementing a border between itself and a space around it, the whole dissolves the border between inside and outside within the self. So it's clearly give us the vignette of the Foucauldian panopticon that's operative in the prison, and that is what is regulating the human body from outside without its visibility. The only way to estimate the time spent in this space is by counting the number of times you have been fed, while it asserts border as an isolating space apart from the ordinary. The whole is ambiguous as a site of boundary maintenance, that it also dissolves border. The constant pressure on the human self and its segregation from the outside world objectifies this prison space, in which the ontology of the prisoner is marked by their ejected object. So that's the object. Then that's how the prison gets objectified, as I have referred to my paper, that the objectified, it's a materiality of their ejection through which the prison gets objectified. The erasure of subjectivity under the assault of repressive state apparatus leads to the rise of a material object that mediates the subject-object relationship in the prison. The topography of the carceral space sounds uncannily similar to Sri Aurobindo's narration in Karakahini. Let me quote from Karakahini: "Attached bathrooms are I know often a part of Western culture, but to have in a small cell a bedroom, a dining room, all rolled into one, that is called too much of a good thing. That is called too much of a good thing. So it clearly indicates how hellish, how brutish the experience of the prison was. And now the process of rewriting the prison or resisting the prison comes in the narrative, where he recognizes consciousness in the non-human beings in the prison, in the animals in the prisons, in the walls, in the gates, and everything. And this realization of non-human quote unquote consciousness leads to a redefinition of the self in Sri Aurobindo's Karakahini, in Sri Aurobindo. And Sri Aurobindo finds his self embedded within a symbiotic register with the non-human other and the human self. And that is how Sri Aurobindo starts rewriting the prison in Karakahini. I am not quoting here. Again, I have mentioned it in my paper. So just for the shortage of time, I am not quoting the portions in this paper, in this presentation. So how to rewrite and resist narrative switch? It offers a possibility for one to recognize the existence of prison, while rejecting the prisons to engage in a form of critique that does not simply reify a particular embodiment understanding of an object. It's through the focus on inner experience, performance, the mutability of prison space, the porous boundary, mobility, and between the institutions, and the ways in which the meanings and significations are manifest within the fluid, ever becoming carceral landscape. So this is how the performativity of the self, the performativity of identity and experience leads to a redefinition, a rediscovery of the prison space. And this is how narrative leads to a rediscovery of the prison. By destabilizing the present logos in favor of a perpetual quest for openness. The present logos is disavowed, and there is a quest for openness. There is a quest for new kind of an exposure through which the prison gets redefined. So unfixing the prison of imagination and going beyond its regulation and the order of things, to quote from Foucault. So rewriting and resisting the prison, the recognition of the presence of the divine or the universal consciousness within the fold of the prison life seems to liberate Sri Aurobindo thought from the its anthropocentric and anthropogenic bias. It is a state of what Sri Aurobindo calls a knowledge by identity, in which the distinction between the subject and the object becomes porous. The pure intentionality instead mediates the relationship between the subject and the object from this perspective in the state of consciousness. Identity achieves a sense of plasticity thereby through the relationship and recognition of a different ontology of prison that remains both within and beyond the humanist fold of negotiation. The symbiotic relationship, the animalist body perceives a symbiotic relationship between the human and the non-human agents like cows, birds, and the way the autobiographical narration embeds the human and the non-human agents within the fold of a co-constitutive network indicates a turn beyond the anthropocentric cartography of prison, the bare life of the prison, the singularity of its experience, and the narrative reconstitution of the subjecthood accord the prisoner a sense of narrative agency to resist the prison by expressing a disavowal, seeking ways of engaging prison without hardening the carapace of its representation, unquote. So a disavowal, quote, and a representation, unquote. So Sri Aurobindo and post-human possibility. So the integration and the experimental formation into supramental realization act as an entry point to the process of Sri Aurobindo's trans-individuation. Here again, I quote from Professor Banerji's early book, Critical Posthumanism. It paves way for a new mode of becoming. Karakahini seems to be an entry point to the integral social thinker Sri Aurobindo, in this integral social thinker Sri Aurobindo, we find a departure from the early anthropocentric and the anthropogenic bias. It conceptualizes an inclusive network of harmony between humans, animals, and lifeless entities. The psychization or the sublimation of consciousness happens through an encounter with the non-human, unfamiliar other, which revises the cultural imaginary of Sri Aurobindo in the post-Pondicherry phase. Sri Aurobindo thus develops a new route of consciousness through Karakahini, where the human and the non-human are involved in a symbiotic relationship, continually testing and resolving the anthropocentric hierarchies drawn along the lines of colonial national biopolitics. Thank you so much. Thank you for your opportunity. I know I have exceeded time. Thank you for allowing me this extra time. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. And I find myself intrigued with the whole concept of transformation within the prison context. And I'm thinking of Nelson Mandela, I'm thinking of Mahatma Gandhi, and how that enclosure time has been so transformative for so many. And I'm hoping that we'll have a little bit more time to pursue this following. But I think for sake of time, we do need to go on to our next speaker now. So I know I've seen, yes, here's Alicia Gonzalez. If you could come to the fore, please.
Hi, are you able to stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, Shubham, you'll need to stop share. Thank you.
Hi. Here we go. Hi, yeah, so my name is Alicia Gonzalez. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's great to be able to participate in a symposium held in India, all the way from California. And so I've become increasingly fascinated by India's yoga tradition in general, and the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo in particular, especially its application as a technology of post-human becoming, which I'll be discussing today as it relates to our future ontology and the future ecology of our planet. So I'd like to begin this talk by positioning my points within the realm of post-humanism as it relates to the evolution of consciousness in the human. And by consciousness, I don't mean human consciousness guised as mental cognition. I'm referring to the fundamental movement and energy of existence, Brahman consciousness as Chit, but also Chit Shakti, creative energy, and conscious force. This includes emanations of consciousness above and below the human range, from the appearance of the atom to the outskirts of the cosmos. And drawing from India's yoga tradition, we can also understand this as a world of relations between Purusha and Prakriti, between soul and nature as they come to know themselves in existence. So when I say the evolution of consciousness in the human, what I'm talking about is the arriving at a new ontology, similar to Nietzsche's Übermensch, that is a perfected in its nature. Drawing from the work of form is the Gnostic being, quote unquote. However, viewed in linear time, we are a long way off from the Übermensch or Gnostic being. So today I'll be talking about the process or praxis for getting there and the stops we need to make along the way. Sri Aurobindo sees this process actualized through what he terms integral yoga, a psycho-spiritual technology of becoming with deep roots in yoga and Tantra. Thus, integral yoga is not a physical yoga or even an applied philosophy per se, but a way of life that imbues all layers of our existence and what we humans can utilize to spur our evolution of consciousness. Again, by drawing heavily on South Asian formulations of Purusha, which he affirmed as self-spirit, and Prakriti, which he affirmed as nature, including, and I think this is of note, body, matter, and the phenomenal universe. In his philosophical writings, Aurobindo made the case that a transmutation of the human into the post-human would not occur in a box, but in symbiotic harmony with our shared ecosystems, helping all facets of life, for example, biological, ontological, sociological, perfect their self-expression. Integral yoga as a psycho-spiritual technology is able to bring about the divinizing of our planet, which of course is also nature. This unfolding symbiosis, actualized by the human in transition, helps us make our way to the post-human Gnostic being. The point of distinction here is that integral yoga is not exclusively about the human exceeding its ontological and evolutionary limits without concern for life beyond itself, but the perfected self-expression of nature, of our flora and fauna, our ecosystems and biosphere, all of these components of existence coming into the fullest form of their own self-expression. This is due to the inextricably interdependent makeup of our planet, with each aspect of life a microcosm of the macrocosm. So when it comes to the ecological changes and climate breakdowns besieging us, integral yoga relies first and foremost on human nature and the soul of Purusha within, which Sri Aurobindo termed the psychic being, not new AI, artificial intelligence technologies developed from the same psychopowers and consumption-oriented systems of industrial economy that continue to fuel our current crises of consciousness. Thus, our first task for actualizing a transformation of consciousness to right these crises is foregoing our hierarchic understanding of planetary life with human-centric capital at its apex. This can be done through the individual's process of self-deconstruction, again, a yoga. Through this process, there's a real potential to realign the components of ourselves and our biosphere into an interconnected and relational whole, again, a microcosm of the macrocosm. And understanding our interdependent nature and consciousness requires revisiting the building block of all life, which is matter. Embracing the possibility, behaviors, and patterns is key if we are to collectively progress toward a revisioning of our evolutionary future. This includes expanding our methods of knowledge acquisition beyond the empirical, rational, and evidence-based. In our globalizing world, these are becoming increasingly limiting methodologies, and is especially done to conventional side of the hegemony of the modern knowledge academy. When we expand in this way, we are able to hold the paradox of the world as a material and immaterial field, a field of both evolution and involution, one that is infused with Purusha and activated by Prakriti, a world within that is a microcosm of this macrocosm. For Sri Aurobindo, this broadening or extending of ourselves and the way we know the world beyond our situational conditioning is the crux of his yoga, one that ultimately and evolved consciousness in order for symbiotic innovations to occur. His yoga is an arrangement for codependent karmic makeup. Filled, full, and fulfilled is one yogic path of post-human becoming that implies a shifting human subjectivity with pre-individual or post-individual subjecthood that ultimately transforms nature. So when it comes to the aforementioned higher mind, Sri Aurobindo delineated out 5 higher planes: the higher mind, the illumined mind, the intuitive mind, the overmind, and ultimately the supermind. Through integral yoga, the human should aspire to access these realms beyond its current mentality. By increasingly accessing these higher planes of mind from above, higher ranges of consciousness are able to stabilize in the human, helping to evolve consciousness in nature and further transmute changes within the being, such as fragmentation, individuation, reintegration, and new physical, vital, mental, psychic, and spiritual capacities. This in turn transmutes a change without in the connected procritic world. So as we continue on our post-human journey, I argue for a comprehensive ecological reworking of our sociocultural systems and structural actions. Through this individual and collective deconstruction, higher planes of mind may emerge in us spontaneously, helping us exceed ourselves and helping our ecosystems toward their own self-realizations on their own terms, devoid of human interference. I'm going to read an excerpt from D.P. Chattopadhyay's seminar that helps clarify these points on mind and nature. Quote, Sri Aurobindo is naturalist in a special sense. He affirms the reality of matter and at the same time highlights its imperfection. He affirms the reality of life world and points out its imperfection and even distortion. He analyzes the rich complexity of the human mind and also shows its inadequacy to grasp the integrality of reality as a whole, end quote. I find this to be a great example of Aurobindo's push from anthropocentric exceptionalism. There is much work ahead for the human, and on the path of integral yoga, it is our internal agency that really matters. This is a crucial point to consider because so much of our current ecological activism and environmental policies hinge on external agency for tackling climate crises, but there is very little emphasis placed on the internal agency of the human required, and in turn, recognizing the importance of the internal agency of the biosphere. Ergo, Sri Aurobindo sees us humans as the ones tasked with changing our way of being in the world and expanding our subjectivity by successively elevating our mental planes to receive higher forms of consciousness. This work in Sri Aurobindo's schema could ultimately result in the Gnostic being that I referenced at the beginning of this talk, and a considerable change in the life of the world. As he says, quote, in the emergence of the Gnostic being would be the hope of a more harmonious evolutionary order in terrestrial nature. By aspiring for the new ontology and the highest plane of mind of the Gnostic being, a more integral and deeply ecological procritic makeup is possible. One with evolutionary powers or siddhis for self-perfected change that counter the anthropocentric powers of destruction and their corresponding economic and utilitarian strong arms. This transformation of consciousness in the human, resulting in planetary ontological changes, is again a microcosm of the macrocosm. There is an inherent reciprocity in this evolutionary change. So to conclude, there are many practices of integral yoga beyond the mental landscape that help de-center the human without catalyzing its disembodiment. These can help us all lead a more embodied, transformed, post-human life in a plural way, while also helping us arrive at higher and higher ranges of consciousness and harmonious planetary life. I'll leave you with this final quote from Sri Aurobindo. The perfection of the integral yoga will come when each man is able to follow his own path of yoga, pursuing the development of his own nature in its upsurging towards that which transcends the nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. That was stunning. I really appreciated the subtext here, which speaks to the need for sadhana, that there must be practice in order for this profound connectivity to emerge. So thank you so much. And now I'd like to invite Asajit Dutta to the fore, and the title of the talk, The Post-Human and the Burial Ground, Unraveling the Headless and the Crematorial Calling.
Okay, thank you so much. I think I would be needing the share screen option. Am I audible properly?
Yes.
Okay. I don't think it's working properly, but
yeah, it will come. So
Okay.
just, yeah, you'll push that and then miraculously you will be shared.
Okay. Okay. So let me begin my paper anyway, and not wait for it. Okay. So what I'll be trying to do is talk a bit about Donna Haraway's speculative fabulation in her book Staying with the Trouble, and how she goes into the future, far into the future, and talks about species intermingling and species coexistence and species merging, and how she talks about not post-humanism, but post-humicities, and not human, but humus, or looking at the human as humus, as ground, as earth, as compost, as she puts it. And rather than going to the future, I would go to the past, to the Indian folkloric past, and look at Kali's ashes as compost, as the ultimate reduction, as the thing that remains. So let us begin with the notion of the continuation in the Anthropocene epoch. And Anthropocene is, of course, something which also is later rejected by Donna Haraway. So there are predominantly two vital ways to continue or remain. So one is, of course, presence, and the second is absence. So in presence, the human animals extend their stay on the earth, either through post-human interactions or interrelations and assemblages, or, of course, the other side is the transhumanist uploading of consciousness into machining. But on the other hand, absence then is linked to total disappearance, extinction, existing as spectral forms, as fossils, as geological impressions. So Anthropocene requires recognition of our precarious situation. Extinction demands an imagination of self-annihilation, of reading ourselves as a nomadic process and in environmental histories. The question that remains is not how to save humans, drowning in cognitive capitalism and sixth mass extinction, but rather if it's possible to track and locate interkingdoms so that what emerges is not entirely the anthropos, but an interconnected symbiont. So what is simultaneously imperative is to find the ground, geographical, political, and ethnographic, and the local perspective from which one effectuates the crisis. It is also equally necessary to explore the surrounding habitat, not just your neighborhood flora and fauna, but the lives of endangered species and the debilitating effects of technological growth. Perhaps a way out of this imminent ending is to be excavated from mythologies, spiritual dimensions, and speculative fabulations, which, of course, Haraway does. So we escape this labyrinth only by perceiving it as a forest and following the animal as our guide. To comprehend the human toward death, we must identify them as ash or food for animals, as bones and flesh turning into filth and garbage. Journeying to the beginning also assists in solving the anthropocentric puzzle. Humans evolving out of the ancient virosphere, and viruses like cyanobacteria oxygenating the air, or genetically modifying placental mothers to give birth. So you either go to the first creation of the human being, or the fabulation, the science fiction of Donna Haraway, where she talks about two species coming together, or multi-species existences. So my article will focus on a kind of realignment of humans, animals, and the environment with the help of Indian mythical and spiritual histories. As my vantage point, I would like to focus on the speculative inventions of human-animal symbionts by Donna Haraway in a phenomenal work on the Thulucene, in Staying with the Trouble. So Haraway weaves the Camille stories. I'm sorry I can't show. I really wanted to show you the picture of the monarch butterfly, but it's just not happening. I don't know why.
Try it again. See, maybe it's working now. They may have enacted it.
Okay. It just. Somehow it's just not reading.
Can you see the share screen green button? Share screen, can you see that?
Yeah. Yes, I can see that. I've clicked on that.
I see. Then there's a problem.
There must be a problem. it wants an access. I'm so sorry about that. Anyway, let me continue with the thing. She talks about Camille's stories around the children of the compost. She talks about the children of the compost, a community surviving in a more paralyzing, complex environment by merging with different species and intuiting themselves as humans rather than as humans or post-humans, right? So Camille's stories talks about these symbiotic beings. It will be a combination of human and a monarch butterfly, and that's what I wanted to show, because it has the face of a woman and the breast of a woman and the body of a butterfly with wings. So it's a beautiful artwork which Haraway borrows from Mexico, and thus it is androgynous in appearance with visible and sensory features of both their parents. So it's a beautiful thing where the Camille children, in a later phase, in a later part, in a speculative future, in a science fiction future, in a fictive future, will have three parents, okay? Where the woman, the mother, will adopt one member of the endangered species, and then a kind of mating would take place, and that mating would not really depend on the human. It would be a kind of natural thing where the mating would happen, and the child, the Camille child, will have traits of both the parents. So technically the child will have three parents, the father, the mother, and one from the endangered species. So that is the fabulation that she takes part in. The third, so Camille children follow a three parents model, the third being an animal from an endangered species. These stories emerge as a response to the demographic and ecological crisis threatening the existence of all lives on this planet. Haraway borrows the Proto-Germanic Guman, G-U-M-A-N, Guman, which later changes into human. But both come as soiled. They both have the meaning of soil, with the earth and its critters, rich in humus, humane, earthly beings as opposed to the gods. So in Hebrew, Adam comes from Adamah, or ground, and in SF, science fiction universe, Adam, Guman, Adamah become more microbiome of fermenting critters of many genders and kinds, that is companion species, at table together, eating and being eaten, messmates, compost, that's what Haraway says, being eaten and eating. And that's where I will also bring Kali, where she is also someone who eats and is also eaten. So Haraway's Thulucene, not Anthropocene and not Capitalocene, but she names it Thulucene, highlights sympoiesis, and which is making with, rather than autopoiesis, which is self-making. It is a kind of tentacular becoming in a heterogeneous society that believes in the manifesting forces of Gaia, but she doesn't talk about Gaia, she goes underground, beneath, far beneath, and making kin rather than making children, right? That is where she is different. So Thulucene will be broken down into Greek root thon, which means underground, earth, and deeper, and kainos, meaning that which is marked by the temporality, which is now, which is not ancient, and at the same time it is ancient. So the tentacles of the chimerial creature Haraway adopts from Paimoa thulu, spider, the octopus cyanea, and Medusa's hair. So that's a combination she gives. Okay, Medusa's hair has tentacles, octopus has tentacles, and also the spider also has the legs and like tentacles. So these conjoinings and holobionts are of course coming together. So she says these holobionts, these assemblages where it is a kind of merging of multiple creatures, they crop up from compost piles, okay, from garbage, from filth, and it rises anew as if. So Haraway refers to animagenesis, in which as derivative from animism, one establishes connections with ghosts and spirits that reside in material things. Humans, Haraway suggests, must be read as humus and not post-human or organic soil to engender possibilities of a restructuration formed through decomposition of not only the flesh, but of the anthropocentric ways. Unlike Haraway's forward march to new compositions of world making and species making, I return the making where everything is subsumed into a cosmic oneness, a horizontal coexistence rather than a vertical one, of course, through exchange and inwardness. The lines that follow take us to a similar kind of world making, full of multi-species possibilities, unknowing one's position on Earth and reimagining convergence. So death especially is one of the foundational object of my research also here. So death in ancient societies was not subsumed into linear time, but broadened as part of cyclical or seasonal time. We all know that. But life, both in its cellular form and living matter, flesh, perpetually undergoes death and decay. While cells wither and regenerate inside, bodies post-death transform into post-human compost, and not post-human, post-human compost. So my paper attempts to locate the essence of the non-dual posthumous, so posthumous, which is what human becomes after death, earth, ground, ash, through Kali's post-human reduction of humans into dirt and cinders. Kali's evolution in tantric philosophy works in tandem with post-dualistic post-humanism that erases the rigid symbolic distinction between life and death. Kali as black night, death, all-destroying time, dissolves all forms into a deathless void. As darkness herself, Kali unifies duality, disintegrates colors, and haunts funeral grounds. The forms of Kali, and I'll be dealing with primarily two forms, Chinnamasta, which is one with the severed head, and of course the other one is Shoshan Kali or Smashana Kali, or the dweller on or the dweller of cremation grounds. I'll primarily take two of them. So Chinnamasta is of course balanced over the copulating Rati and Kama, and feeding her own blood to her companions, Dakini and Varnini, is the figure of self-sacrifice, of destruction, detachment, and subsuming, and the necessary corollary to the process of creation. Again, Smashana Kali, one who lives in the cremation grounds, represents the death of ego, the burning and returning of all that is human to ashes, sky, earth, and space, where the human breaks down to humus, compost. I'll not talk about, due to a lack of time, I'll not talk about the hands and her gesture, but her tongue is very significant, of course. So her lolling tongue desires to taste debris and trash, all that is forbidden by society, polluted, littered. Kali derives her from forms through dhyan mantras, meditational realizations. That's what dhyan mantras are, which are intrinsic visualizations of people undergoing yogic discipline or a continuous harnessing of the nervous system. So it is very interesting to note actually here that the source of the 108 names of Kali is Indian sculpture, where the ideal measure of a figure is called Tala Sharira, which believes in the theory that the total length of our palm is the length of our face. And thereon the entire body is measured by placing 9 talas horizontally and 12 angulas. Angula is finger, 12 angulas. So 9 multiplied by 12 is 108. Again, they refer to the yogic experience of synchronized bija mantrik, and bija mantra is monosyllabic mantras, vibrations manifesting through 108 parts of the body. So you understand how I will show you right now how Kali itself or herself, as you see her, is a kind of symbiont or a kind of holobiont, which is a formation through the human, the nature, the animalistic, and the cosmic. So she herself signifies a kind of assemblage kind of creation. So I'm trying to show the goddess as a holobiont, community herself. Okay, something which let's say Haridas talks about, the community of the future. I think this is the Kali is the community of the past, composed of yogic sadhana, animals, nature and astronomical objects. And of course, a question might come in that why Kali and why not someone else? Because perhaps Kali is the only goddess, the only god for whom it is not expansion, but it's contraction. And everything ends in Kali, okay? And then the process of regeneration comes. So first there is destruction, and then there's regeneration. First there is a kind of normalization of death, a kind of acceptance of death, a kind of embracing of death, and only then there is a kind of regeneration, only through death, only through the ashes, as if. So Kali's name signifies a movement from the circumference to the center. And unlike Brahma, who is the expansion from the center where everything is unmanifest into a continuous circle, the entire world is Brahman, emerging from Brahma, who is both immanent and transcendent. Parallelly, when the world begins contracting, disappearing level by level, and merges with the center, which is also a withdrawal of senses, where the world ceases to exist and you are with the onlyness of yourself, that experience in meditation is Kaivalya. And Kaivalya is, of course, solitude through detachment. And Kali is that definite center where one's whole world has shrunk into the center. This is one of the reasons behind equating Kali and Krishna, whose etymological root is in Sanskrit is dhatu, krish, and how in Sanskrit they are both almost similar, where they're krim and klim. Krim is electrical energy and fire beckoning Kali, the goddess of time and transformation, and klim is Krishna, reproductive, water promoting magnetic mantra of Krishna, the god of devotion and beauty. And krim and klim in Sanskrit are often used interchangeably. R and L in Sanskrit are interchangeable. So Kali is both death as folding up of the world and also a devourer of death and time. At the end of the contraction, time dissolves. With her gaping mouth, she swallows both Kala, and Kala is time, and Mahakala before time splits up into three dimensions, which transforms her into an absolute swatantra, independent entity with a black body and disheveled hair, with a tongue, and the tongue symbolizes the anuchishta. Anuchishta is that word that has not been corrupted by the tongue, the word that emerges from one's experience of Kali. So it's very interesting that when Krishnananda Agambhogisha of Navadvip finally crystallized the modern iconography of Kali, which we see all around us, we received an evolution from the haggard Chamunda. I had the picture. I had clicked in, at Chetla, and where they worship almost all the figures of Kali, and it was a beautiful image. I wanted to show it, but I'm so sorry. So the transformation from Chamunda, which is just hunger, to an all-ingesting Kali who is non-dual and self-eating. So Kali is self-eating. So I devour myself, right? Which is also in Sanskrit, so sho ado swad. So sho ado, sho means me, and ado means eating. So I eat myself. Actually, shad is eating yourself, which we use in a very different context of taste. So, and next comes how she's linked to nature, the Chandrakala that is there on her face, sometimes on her crown, the moonbeam, Chandrakala, the moonbeam on her head is the 14th digit of the moon, symbolizing the mind, just before vanishing into Amavasya, which is total darkness, which is only when the goddess is worshipped. Kali then becomes the unifying principle, the samhara, or taking back into and obliteration of the world. I will skip some portions and come to the primary argument. So the funeral fire that we connect with Smashana Kali connotes the extinguishing of ignorance and inhibitions, of karma and attachments, and the rising of the blazing of the inner fire of knowledge. That is Kali herself as a cataclysmic and transform awareness of the temporality and nothingness of human desires, and thus serve as the appropriate ground for the spiritual quest of the sadhaka. And this is very interesting what David Kinsley says about the need, in fact, in tantric philosophy, and some sometimes it is placed just beside you, and it's called savasana. Sava means shub, which means dead body. So savasana, the sadhana or worship of the corpse. It's very interesting what happens in that sadhana. The sadhaka, which is the one who is the tantric, the sadhaka sits astride a dead body, and the devata, the goddess, materializes by means of the corpse. There is possession of it. God possesses the corpse, animates it. Avesa, it's called avesa, animates it. That is entry of the devata into the dead body. At the conclusion of a successful rite, it is said that the head of the corpse turns around and, facing the sadhaka, speaks, bidding him name his boon, which may be spiritual or worldly, anything he wishes for. So what is important is that Kali of the burial ground, Swashana Kali, alludes to the ever-presence of death, burning and turning into ashes. Here, ashes, and this is very interesting, especially very interesting, where ashes do not denote the categorical death of everything, but rather that which remains and is indestructible. What remains of the body are the ashes. Kali as ashes, that is that adamantine center that shall not perish further, and the center from which the world shall materialize again. Destruction, reconstruction unfold in a concurrent circular mode. For Kali, the objective is not directed at reproduction, but unification. In that sense, she is Kaivalya Daini, the giver of unity and detachment at the same time. And this is the opposition. You are united, at the same time you're detached. An illuminating example, I think I will just quote a very small portion and go to the conclusion of my paper, is from Daniel Odier, who talks about this experience of dying and becoming, and I think that's where Kali merges so beautifully with Donna Haraway. And I'm just reading a little part from this, where he says, "You are being reconnected to nature. Become one with everything. Your body decomposes. Pieces of flesh, muscles, organs separate from the bone and fall to the ground, which welcomes them. In this return to the elements, there is a veritable voluptuousness that needs to be severed. Because the very idea of death terrifies us, whereas the experience can be felt as a grand return to nature. The earth absorbs the pieces of flesh, the bones appear as a beautiful whiteness, and from the effects of wind, sun, and weather, the pieces break apart and are ground into a powder that mixes with the earth until you have completely disappeared into the voluptuousness of a return to unity. Imagine that all the cells of the flesh come back together, vivified by the earth. They reform muscles, which also is reassembled. In this return, an organic pleasure that has been washed free of its memories." And that's how I think I connect it with Donna Haraway, which is washed free of memories, and it's a reassembling, a new freshness, a harmonious and delicious functioning. It is as if there is no longer any difference between your body and the environment. You are one with everything. And that's where Kali becomes so important, because where she is great nature, she is consciousness, she is happiness, the quintessential. And in fact, Kali's Vahana, the deity mount, Jackal, is also considered Kali herself. And that's where the animal comes in. So if you feed the jackal, in fact, before the puja starts, before the worship starts, you have to create that bhog, which is the prasada, and go to the forest, deep into the forest, and offer it to the jackal, right? Which is considered Kali's Vahana, and also Kali herself. If the jackal eats the food, that means Kali is prasanna, Kali is satisfied, and that's where Kali also becomes that animal. In fact, in many in Kundalini, the rise of Kundalini in our body is depicted by the movement of animals. So either jumping and rising like a monkey, or shooting straight up like a snake. Okay, so and also sadhakas, when they begin their tantra, in many tantric traditions, Pashu or animal is a classified state of human who performs their Vedic, Vaishnava, Shaivite rituals, or referred to a disciple of a guru who has just started his journey. And it's very interesting what Seema Mohanty in her book of Kali says, that nothing in nature appears else. According to Tantra, the essence of mineral is transformed by plants into sap, which is then consumed by animals and humans as food. In the body of animals and humans, sap transforms into plasma, flesh, bone, nerves, semen, and blood. Thus, all ends. So I'm not going to Chinnamasta because of lack of time. I'm just ending my paper saying that in Kali, humans can only reach the transcendental by acknowledging and assimilating the animal and the whole of environment within him, by imagining themselves as ashes, as ground, as compost, which is the fertile land for the birth of the conjoined one. We move again from the garbage pile and the heap of corpses surrounding Kali to posthumous existence of Haraway, because we have to remember that in Kali, if you go to Chamunda, especially the tribal avatar of Kali, Chamunda resides in spit, in feces, in urine. You have in Chamunda's around Chamunda, you have the Pisacha. The Pisacha is the ghost of dirt, the ghost of garbage, the ghost of filth. And from there you have a kind of regeneration. So you also actually are worshipping that which is unsanitized, worshipping that which is rejected, which is abhorred, which is not taken into civilization. And yet you are worshipping that to come back to civilization as if, and also to come back to yourself in a very reformed way. So to end with Haraway again, Haraway clarifies that critters are at stake in each other, in every mixing and turning of the terran compost pile. We are compost, not post-human. We inhabit the humicities and not humanities. Critters, human and not, become with each other, compose and decompose each other in every scale and register of time and stuff, in symbiotic tangling, in ecological evolutionary development, earthly worlding and unworlding. So like Haraway's Camille, Kali too is a compostist, a posthumous compost maker who spawns a posthuman interlinked being non-native to her own humanness. Thank you so much for your patience, and sorry for exceeding the time.
Thank you. And one other word in that family of words that we might consider is humility, that in face of the enormity of the diversity of life, we come to a sense of our smallness, and through our smallness, we feel a larger connection. So that was really, really quite beautiful, quite profound. And now I invite Jonathan K to come to the fore, and the title of Jonathan's presentation, and I was so happy to hear his performance earlier today. The title is Becoming Raga, North Indian Raga Music as a Technology of Integral Post-Human Becoming.
Thank you, Christopher. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll talk through some of the main points of my paper that's available on the website. I'll just start by saying I'm a PhD student at the California Institute of Integral Studies in the East-West Psychology Department. And my inquiry is coming from an autoethnographic perspective. I'm a jazz musician, originally from Toronto, Canada. And I moved to Calcutta to learn Indian classical music. I ended up living there for about 10 years and learned how to play raga music on the saxophone and as well as the esraj. And so this work is coming from my immersion into the culture and my sort of like a holistic approach to approaching music through a cultural lens, immersive cultural lens. So some of the post-human questions that I feel like my time in India was addressing in my life. How can we musically build an interface between the inside and the outside, the infinite and the finite, the human and the non-human? And a very important question, how can we approach understanding integration between this inside and outside? In general, my work is approaching sort of the horizons of thought and sound. And my time in India, especially learning in the raga music tradition, radically displaced the sort of the rational human as a center, and asked, how can we become a raga? Specifically, I'm talking about North Indian raga music. This paper draws upon the theories of integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo and a little bit of the post-structuralism of Gilles Deleuze. So the question of integration was very important, being a cross-cultural subject. I found that the questions posed by Sri Aurobindo and taken up in his life and development of yoga were very relevant. And as I began learning raga music as a form of integral yoga from my guru, Shantanu Bhattacharya, I found that there was a very natural way in which this praxis allowed me to engage in music as a problematic field of becoming that was broad enough, that was wide enough to incorporate cross-cultural questions. And Sri Aurobindo was designing, or was taking up yoga to develop integral questions that pertain to the times, being a modern yogi, questions that we could say are from modernity, engaging modernity. So Dr. Banerji writes of this integral consciousness. Sri Aurobindo conceived of integral consciousness as a supramental ontology representing an aporetic, perspectival vanishing point in mental experience and a possibility for future evolution. Thus, an integral consciousness is seen by him as a difference, not in degree, but in kind, from mental consciousness, one to which absolute unity and radical infinity are identical. End quote. And this can be seen as an equivalent to Deleuze's plane of immanence, in which he describes pluralism equals monism from 1,000 Plateaus. So I found myself engaging in music throughout my whole life, but especially as I was learning music as a form of integral yoga, it became an existential field of becoming, and the ragas became structures of becoming. And this challenged me to understand music beyond classical or structuralist musicological models that I was raised on in the West. And so specifically, I found that the raga engagement with raga music and the raga was actually a site of individuation, of yogic individuation, that was based on transduction, which is a non-dialectical and non-representational field. And we can understand transduction from the metaphysics of Gilbert Simondon, who talks about it as a process by which heterogeneous elements form into individuating series of becomings. So more specifically about how I learned raga music as a spiritual sadhana or spiritual discipline, I learned from my guru that the raga was a deity, and that deity was an archetypal god, you could say. And in this paper, in the language of this paper, it's an agent of the outside. One of the goals was to become possessed by this deity. So with proper proper training and proper practice, then you can enter into relation and actually become possessed by this deity. And I had certain experiences listening to my guru or other maestros in India. And later on in my development as a musician, a raga musician, I found myself having experiences which really made me question how this was happening, and how this interface with the outside was how it worked in a way. Another goal of the raga music, as I learned it, was to facilitate an integral transformation, which was something that is not held by the tradition as a whole, but came from specifically my individual guru. Also, in relation to a lot of what has been said, how this music is also a technology of liberation, and how I use raga music as a way to carve out space outside of neoliberal subjectivity and a cultural container that I was from, and challenging. Something I would like to bring, an intellectual connoisseur of raga music and the raga music sadhaka, or the aspirant, or a listener of raga music who engages in music, listening to raga music as a way of spiritual transformation. And the connoisseur, which is definitely a huge part of the tradition and culture, in some ways it can be considered a consumer of raga flavors and a collector of cultural information and experiences. To the connoisseur, the raga performance is not necessarily an individuating an event, but can act as simply a cultural commodity that can be utilized as a superficial sign of status within an elite class. And so obviously I'm differentiating my experience with the music from that. So coming now to more of the musical elements here, I described this individuating space as raga space, rather than raga as one thing, which I will later describe a little more clearly. It's more of a space. It's a problematic field, like I had said. And so we have musical elements that can be understood through more classical notions of musicology, like the notes, like the time or the laya, the rhythm, the tala, the structure, which I call phraseology, the lyrics of the composition, the mood of the raga, and et cetera, et cetera. But there's a lot of other elements that are in this field of becoming that we need to also take note of. For instance, intra, supra, and transpersonal elements, including the mood of the performer in that specific moment, guru, and from the tradition, the geocultural style, which is called a gharana, which is very strong in North Indian classical music, the time of day, the psycho-spiritual and the natural elements that make up that time of day. For instance, where the sun is in the sky, so like the weather, the acoustics of the hall, the audience, and of the performance. All these go into creating a larger space in which the music acts as a vehicle of transformation. I'd also like to now bring a little bit of attention to the nature of the ritual, the sort of a sonic ritual that raga music can be understood through as well. And I found in Sri Aurobindo's work a very interesting notion. And so the Hindu ritual, which is the puja, can be considered an architectonic organization of spatial and temporal sacred materials, which create an interface, or a sieve, Sri Aurobindo calls divaspade, between the individual and the cosmic or the transcendent. And post-Deleuzian scholar O'Sullivan points out a ritual can be a space-time machine to what lies outside of the human, right? Not a representational, but something altogether different. A summoning of other beings, a space and a practice of incarnation in which the invisible, that which lies outside the human register, outside the fantasies of realism, outside mundane time, is made visible. The puja operates as a portal into or onto these other worlds, precisely as a kind of space-time machine. And so I found myself looking at raga space and how it functioned as a ritual. And the idea of the architectonic of this ritual was very important in my understanding. So now coming to becoming raga, traditional ideas about what a raga is, and musicology and ethnomusicology is being generally understood as a scale or a mode, a melodic ascent and descent, for example. But I found myself wanting to extend some of these ideas. So I'm looking at a raga more as a melodic being in becoming, composed of a collection of intricate melodic phrases that I call phraseology, informed by a governing architectonic structure. And based on the work of Ganguly, who was at the turn of the 20th century looking at Tantra and raga, he talks about ragas as having two images, a sound image and a form image. And at this point, I'd like to bring in a little bit of a Deleuzian metaphysics, a model that Deleuze posits in a book he wrote on Spinoza. And in this book, Deleuze talks of a plane of transcendence or organization, which is in relation to a plane of immanence or composition. And I began thinking the raga through these two planes. So to go into how I understand the plane of transcendence or organization, this would be considered the being of the raga. And it's a praxis of musical contemplation on the raga phraseology. So what is passed down through the tradition, but as the phrases that make up the core of the essence of the raga, basically. This can be likened to the image form of Ganguly, which is, again, like the genetic kind of potential in seed form, but is not in time. It's a spatial image. Debashish, Banerji calls it the eternal image. This can also be likened now to Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga as the yoga of the Purusha, the soul, in which one becomes the transcendental witnessing consciousness separate from the automatons of nature, and as well as known as jnana in the Upanishads. And so I found myself seeing one aspect of the raga as occupying this plane of transcendence and organization. The second plane, which is in relation to that, is the plane of immanence or composition. And we can consider this the becoming of the raga in time. And this is where the architectonic it will create the image of the raga as it's being composed in duration. This can be likened to the sound form of Ganguly, in which the regeneration of the internal image is in time. And in terms of integral yoga, the yoga of Prakriti, in which from the freedom of the poise of the witnessing Purusha, one can sanction and enter into Prakriti as the Ishvara or Lord of nature. This can be understood as the Vijnana in the Upanishads. So with these two, with this model basically of understanding a raga, in my experience, as being these two interconnected planes, it seemed to me that the raga music can be a model of becoming integral. And based on the first formulation of Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga, the 7 quartets of becoming, in which he was his own personal praxis and a way of developing an integral consciousness, which is based on the simultaneous knowledge of jnana and vijnana in the 7 quartets. And the Siddhi Chatushtaya, the quartet of yoga, perfection, is the simultaneous knowledge of both. And that's the knowledge of the being and becoming. So in conclusion, I found that raga music is a praxis that can illuminate the essential nature of these two different forms of knowledge. And in my experiences has helped me develop ideas of, and experiences of how to cultivate an integral consciousness. So becoming raga can be seen as a sonic model for building an interface between the inside and the outside, the human and the raga deity can be put into relation. And this has been a mode of exploring post-human possibilities, which is right at the horizon of thought and sound. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. That was really superb. And the autoethnography, the emplacement of yourself into the story being told, is so critical and important hermeneutically. And as we heard you perform earlier today, creating that ambiance, just creating that bhava, if you will, is critical for any human future. And I just have one small suggestion by way of bibliography, and I'm going to read you this book title. It's called The Myth of Invariance, The Origin of the Gods, Mathematics, and Music from the Rig Veda to Plato. And if you are familiar, don't know his work, it's stunning. And I highly recommend it. And myself, like so many others, have been transformed by immersive experiences within music. And this work, again, so important to keep moving forward. Now, I'd like us to open to one another, perhaps Shubham, Asajit, and Jonathan and Alicia, if you want to bring yourself on camera and perhaps give a short response to your interlocutors, and the others could perhaps be thinking to generate some questions for the chat. So I'm just randomly going to suggest, Alicia, do you have just sort of a summary in terms of how all of this is fitting together?
I think the beauty is with this plural nature, right, of our post-human endeavors. It doesn't have to fit all together. But yeah, no, each of these presentations touched me in a different way, especially the descriptions around Kali and the self-eating nature in the philosophical context. That was really moving for me. And of course, Jonathan's autoethnographic take, and I always learn more and more about his own experience in the music, as opposed to just, you know, us sitting and receiving it. So that's I think really important part of the sadhana, of the practice. Yeah, I think that's right for right now. I'm still kind of absorbing what's been said, because I would say they stood on their own. You know, there wasn't an exceeding amount of overlap, in my opinion. So.
Right. Yeah, I had the chance to read everyone's paper, and they're just really superb, each in its own way. So Shubham, how would you like to respond to the last several minutes with one another?
Yes, so it's been a learning experience for me, and this is my first post-humanism seminar, so to speak. So I approached the topic from a different angle altogether, and I'm heavily enriched by Oshid's paper and Jonathan's and Alicia, all of your papers, all of your insights. And I am taking a lot from this webinar. That's all I can say, actually.
Great. Okay, Asajit.
Yeah, it was an amazing session, especially all three with your opening up of the Yoga Tantra was amazing. So I may have a question for you and Jonathan. So can I ask you a question? I mean, or is it too late?
Please. Yes.
Yeah. So if we consider yoga, I think it's especially what we are facing right now in India. Can you say a few words about the cross, but also been a victim to a kind of right-wing politics? Do you find a kind of link somewhere?
You know, I'm feeling sort of autoethnographic about all of this. And as I traveled to the universities, and I went to 15 of the 54, and they included Shantiniketan. They included, so many different places, the Parshvanath Vidyapith, and the Department of Physical Education at BHU. And what I found was lots of self-criticism. In other words, there's a reluctance for people to want to follow a common core. There was a little bit of bafflement with the just sheer rupee amounts that were being directed toward this build out of curriculum. And I first learned of this when I was at the United Nations, and Dr. Nagendra, who I have known since 1989, who has been really the mastermind of this implementation that's underway, convened leadership, global leadership from academic yoga communities in New York City. And the question that I posed was, this seemed to have been a hurry up and let's get this fixed quick, because they had just lost elections that were rather critical. And I said, you know, this has been done very quickly. Is there any guarantee of outflow? And it was quite fascinating because all of this has been rather remarkably conceptualized. And the government of India is funding the implementation of 100,000, I guess it's a lot, of wellness centers where people that are having basic health problems will have as part of their workshops with yoga therapists who are being trained at these various facilities. So this was, on the one hand, like big government, and on the other hand, as a person of yoga, I have always seen benefit in sadhana. So, you know, there's no easy answer to the politicization, to the nationalization. And on the one hand, is this a hegemony where, okay, now everybody has to do yoga? Or is this actually for the greater good? And the jury is out. I mean, these university programs are very new. I was rather simultaneously thrilled, excited to meet the students. And as people in India know, very young people are at university a couple of years younger than they are in States. And with this exuberance and this enthusiasm and on to college, and they are seeing this as a pathway into a solid professional middle-class life. And if it all works, I think that's great. And they're so innocent. And the faculty, I mean, the faculty are coming from all manner of preparation. Some of them very advanced scholars of Sanskrit, and some of them phys ed teachers. And there will be hopefully increased knowledge that will be at the ground of this all moving forward. But I've been really stunned and I spent a fair amount of time at the Maharaji Desai National Institute of Yoga in Delhi during my time there in 2019, and participated in a major conference that was convened in Mysore. And I also found myself very othered, okay? I mean, I've been doing yoga for 50 years. I've had, I've been translating Sanskrit for many, many decades. And I showed you the image of, I'd like to think that I have some authenticity and just sort of shoved onto this panel with other Christians and Muslims. And then we were just sort of minor harassed in some very subtle ways. So I hear what you're saying, and I love India and landscape throughout the globe is absolutely fascinating right now. And I think that all of this turmoil, like what you described earlier with Kali self-feeding, that there are so many things that are going into ash and so much potential for renewal and new birth.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I just had a very small question for Jonathan. Can I pose it?
Please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So Jonathan, amazing people in Rakhine that have that. So is it a different kind of emotion we are looking at? I mean, are we looking at a different kind of consciousness altogether, or a kind of different kind of realization altogether? Or is it just the same, is it just the same center of the self that you are going, and the disciplines are different? It's either yoga or raga. I mean, I don't know if it makes much sense, but yeah.
Yeah, great question. Well, I guess considering like the modality of sound, the nature of sound, I think that I would just look to that to sort of help illustrate how that may be different. Because when you become something else, it's really you're being, like I said, blessed by it. It's a sonic form, right? It's not a deity as it may appear in a different sense, right? And I think that the question can be quite open too, depending on what your goal is. I have two gurus I learned singing from. I mentioned Shantanu Bhattacharya in Calcutta. I also lived in Shantiniketan for a couple of years and learned Estaraj from Abir Singh Kangura. And they, although there was an overarching ideal, that yoga provided, but they were slightly different in how they approached it, because one came from Shantanuji came from more of an integral and more of an orthodox approach from integral yoga. Abir was a tantric practitioner. Birbhum is full of there's a lot of Shakti pits and a lot of tantric practitioners there, and so he grew up in that environment. And I found that although sometimes their methodologies changed, sometimes the phenomenology of my experience changed in their presence. Sometimes they'd bring my attention to different elements of this sonic becoming, let's say. It helped, it still was pointed towards a similar goal of my becoming, which I feel like they did share that. But I think that they did give me, there was different experiences. So I think that it can be quite open still, depending on let's say the traditional background and maybe like more nuanced goals of becoming. Like, for instance, the idea of being possessed by the raga. But also at one point, I remember Shantanuji talking about channeling the raga and seeing the raga flow through him. And it was less of being possessed or overcome by it as seeing it, drishti, like a drishti shilpi, right? And he at one point described to me, he's reading the raga phrases as he would be reading a book. He's seeing them. And that is a very different experience. And I think, the recording is. so I think that this is, again, it just creates a field, and I don't think that I fix myself on one of those questions, but I mean, just some ideas based on that. It's not, I'm not going to say there's one way that I'm holding as like the ideal or the one experience that I would see. Is that helpful?
If I may say something, to start with, to Ashijit's question to Jonathan about the experience of being possessed by a raga, the immersive or experience in consciousness related to the experience in yoga. You said, Jonathan, about it being a sonic form, but tantric experience is also that of a sonic form, right? I mean, we're talking about bija mantras. So when you talked about a phraseology being the sound image, right? You talked about it as the eternal image, being a phraseology, which is really a collection of bija mantras from a certain point of view, which come into time as a form of becoming, right? Which is also the same with any ritual. In any ritual, you have a set of bija mantras that are being mobilized in time according to a certain sequence. So I would say the nature of of raga music seen as a form in the way in which you see it is nothing other than a form of yoga from that point of view.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Debashish. Absolutely, yeah. Getting to the bija.
I had one question for Ashijit. I think I really enjoyed your talk. I enjoyed all the talks very much. I enjoyed the talk on Karakahini and also, of course, Alicia. I think there was a lot of overlap between and I think synergy, yet difference between Alicia's and Ashijit's papers. Having to do with cosmogenesis, new types of cosmogenesis, erasures and new becomings. So one question that I had for you, Ashijit, is of course, the whole notion of progressive erasure, progressive death, disappearance and reduction to irreducibility as the foundation of a new becoming. Through symbiosis, as you said, from a yogic standpoint, would be seen as a prakritic process. There is also a purusha process to the whole thing, because tantra includes both purusha and prakriti. For example, even the disappearance into the void and the reappearance, Kali deconstructs, but she also reconstructs. The tantric recreates a body in a sense, and that recreation of the body, however it takes place, also involves a subject. So where is the subject and who is the subject in this form of symbiosis?
Thank you for your question, Professor Banerji. I think the subject is, I think, the sadhaka for me. If that person is engaged in a kind of, for example, Ramakrishna, for example, I think that death is entirely symbolical on the one hand, where the sadhaka destroys himself, reduces himself to ashes, and then becomes a reformation happens. And on the other hand, it is also a kind of physical death, which is of everyone. So for me, the subject is all man, or all human, or all woman, that way, or all things, which at the end of it all reduces to ashes. And that's why I see ash as something which cannot be reduced any further, which is sprinkled over, which goes to either the river or, I remember when my grandmother died and they were burning her inside and I was standing out, something very horribly fascinating happened. I remember where from a kind of chimney, the ash was coming out, and that ash was it was falling on me, and I didn't know what to make of that experience. I hated it. and the entire smell of the burning body, and yet the ashes falling over me. I think I carried my grandmother home. I carried her home when it was all over me, and I had to take a bath. And still it felt that I had not rid myself of the ash. So who is actually the subject? Is my grandmother the subject, or am I the subject? I think we both are, one reduced and one waiting for reduction. That's what I think. I hope it answers the question.
Thank you, Ashish. Yeah, I think it is a nomadic subject in that sense, and also, I think it's a profound question in a sense, because you think about the notions of the trans individual that Simon Don is talking about. That in a way, the reduction of the subject also accompanies the birth of new subjects. And perhaps there is an overcompensation of the subject in which it is a universal subject. It becomes one and many at the same time. And that aspect is really something which is the other side of Kali Tantra. Who experiences the reduction and the reformation. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that ties in very nicely with Donna Haraway material as well.
Yes.
And R. Carlson had a question that further problematizes the ownership of yoga, who owns yoga, and brings up the irony of the so-called nationalists, if I understand the turn of phrase here, silencing climate activists. And I just want to sort of go to Joseph Alter on this, that at the end of the day, and I'm thinking really of Jonathan a little bit about on this sort of track, that everyone likes to make fun of Om, but Om doesn't care. And what Joseph Alter says is that everybody wants to own a piece of yoga, but yoga doesn't care. So from the ash, something new will arise. And I think in our humility, there's so many things that we can't answer, but we have to have some trust. I don't want to call it faith, but some trust that, as Martin Luther King Jr. stated, that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. And if we were doing this 2.5 years ago, or even a year ago, or a year and a half ago, I would probably be less optimistic, but there are signs that I think we've learned some lessons, and that there is an opportunity in the post-humanist phase to really go beyond the constraints of ego, to really go beyond that butting of heads with one another that has been so raucous and so inappropriate. And on the other hand, yeah, we're still in a mess, and that's why we call it samsara.
I think with that, we'll come to a close today. I would like to draw attention to the fact that we have a worldwide audience here. As we are reaching 12:30 here, one of our participants is at 3 a.m. in the morning. That's Jonathan. And I really think we need to respect the time for everybody. So, good night, Jonathan. Happy lunch, the rest of us, and meet you all in the evening. Thank you.
Debashish, it's time to do Darbari Kannada Riyaz. So I'm just going to start my Riyaz now.
Okay.
No, thank you, Debashish. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you all.